Welcome back, and thank you for tuning into Midnight Affairs Tales. We appreciate every single one of you. We'd love to know what part of the world you are watching from right now. Let us know in the comments. Now let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The air was dry as bone. Sand whipped across the broken concrete outside the compound. Gunfire cracked in the distance, but it was the silence on the comms that made Cole Maddox's stomach twist. Bravo 1. Do you copy? He asked into the mic. Nothing but static. Briggs, where the hell are you? He snapped, eyes scanning the ridge to the west. The team was supposed to extract 5 minutes ago. He was sitting in the kill zone. Alone. No eyes. No cover. Cole had been in the Navy for 15 years. SEAL for 10. Led ops in Kandahar, Fallujah, Somalia. He'd faced death too many times to count. But this felt different. Wrong. It wasn't the enemy he feared. It was the silence in his own ear. He checked the coordinates again. Exact drop zone. He was on point. So where the hell were they? Then the roar hit. A distant hum. Growing louder. Unmistakable. Drone. He turned his head and looked to the sky just as the missile dropped. Time slowed. The ground tore upward in a storm of dirt and flame. His body lifted, thrown like a rag doll. Then, darkness. Sometime later, pain. Everywhere. Burning flesh. Blurred vision. He coughed, tasting blood and sand. His leg didn't move. His comms were gone. Gear shredded. One thought clung to his mind. That drone wasn't called by accident. His body screamed, but his brain locked onto one detail. His own team had the drone access. Not the enemy. Not the brass. His own people. He passed out again. And as the blood pooled beneath him, one question dug itself into his soul. Why would my own team leave me behind? Unless they wanted me dead? Wait, I need to tell you something important. Have you ever realized that you keep watching my videos but haven't subscribed yet? This video has reached this point, which means you're enjoying it. So why not subscribe? I have a big goal, 5,000 subscribers, and you can help me reach it. Think about it. If you don't subscribe now, you might miss my next big video. This is the moment. Hit that subscribe button now. Do it now. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss out. I know you'll do it. And when we hit 5,000 subscribers, I have a special surprise for you. Now let's continue story. 2 years earlier, the Pacific slapped against the hull of the USS Jacksonville as Cole stood on the deck, watching sunset bleed across the water. Back then, it was simple. Mission. Team. Brotherhood. He remembered the day he first met Sawyer Briggs. Thought SEALs were taller, Briggs said, tossing his bag down. Cole looked him up and down. Thought assholes were quieter. They'd laughed. Instant connection. Same rhythm, same drive. They were killers with purpose. And in the field, Sawyer always had Cole's six. Or so he thought. Their team became elite fast. Top-tier raids. Classified black ops. Cole led, and Briggs followed. Clean missions. No losses. Until Syria. Now, in a tent half a world away, Cole lay broken, remembering every past op. Every time he had looked Briggs in the eye and trusted him. He thought about Delaney too. How she used to worry. How she cried the first time he deployed. But the last year, things changed. She stopped waiting up. She stopped asking where he was going next. And now? She probably thought he was gone for good. But not yet. A local man entered the tent. Desert robes, weathered face. He offered Cole a battered satellite phone. American. Call. You. Cole's fingers trembled as he took it. Static bust. Then he heard it, Briggs' voice. Drone strike confirmed. No trace. He's gone. Laughter followed. They were celebrating. The phone fell from his hand. Cole clenched his jaw, voice hoarse, teeth bloodied. You think I'm gone? You think this is over? He wasn't just a soldier. He was a SEAL. And he was coming back. Leadership is built on trust. But trust, Cole now understood, was the biggest illusion of all. Days passed. Pain blurred into time. The locals who found him, rebels, outcasts, not even on any U.S. radar, helped him piece himself back together. They didn't ask questions. They saw a half-dead man in the desert and decided to help him. That was more than his brothers had done. One day, he sat outside the tent, wrapped in gauze, staring at the sunrise. The same sun rose over Washington, over Delaney, over the team who toasted to his death. He was no longer a commander of anything, not on paper, not to the Navy. They'd listed him Kia, but in his chest, command still lived. Not over men now, over vengeance. He replayed every op in his head, every debrief, every time Briggs had looked at him and said, "You're the reason we come back alive." Lies. Delaney's last email haunted him. "We'll talk when you're home. Things are complicated." He didn't understand it then. He did now. They needed him out of the way. He stood on shaking legs, breathing sharp and slow. "If I was worth killing," he muttered, "then I'm worth finishing what I started." He'd find out how deep it went, and he'd bury them with it. As the wind howled over the dunes, Cole made one silent promise. He wouldn't die out here. Not nameless. Not forgotten. He was a SEAL commander, and that title wasn't given. It was earned in blood. Now it was time they learned what happens when you leave a commander to die. They didn't just betray him. They left him. Not in the way soldiers fall in war. No flag-draped coffin. No honorable mention. No medals. Just nothing. Cole sat by a cracked mirror inside the shelter, wrapping gauze around his shoulder. Every movement made him flinch, but he didn't stop. He'd been through worse, but never like this. He wasn't grieving death. He was grieving betrayal. The people who had followed him into hell, who toasted him after ops, who hugged his wife at the after-parties and called her family. They had left him to die. And Delaney. He used to tell her everything. Every fear, every scar, every hard choice. She had cried the night before his deployment, held onto him like she couldn't breathe without him. And now she was holding Sawyer. He didn't need evidence. He had instincts. And instincts don't lie. She moved on too fast, too publicly, too proudly. The news clips he watched on a dusty tablet made it worse. Commander Cole Maddox, honored in ceremony after combat death. Widow Delaney Maddox speaks on sacrifice and strength. She wore black. She had tears, but her hands never shook. Her eyes never cracked. Left. That word sat in his bones like ice. "You left me," he whispered. "All of you." He wasn't just angry. He was hollow. And from that emptiness, something cold and sharp was born. Not grief. Not pain. Purpose. What was it all for? That question haunted him. 15 years in the Navy. 10 as a SEAL. Classified missions, body bags, trauma he never told a soul about. All that blood, all that loyalty, for what? To be discarded when he became inconvenient? He scrolled through encrypted files he'd managed to recover through an old black market contact. His fingertips hovered over one labeled Operation Quiet Tide. He opened it, and his breath stopped. It was a deployment contract. Military SEALs. Defense signatures. But it wasn't just a mission report. It was a target list. And at the bottom, asset termination clearance, Cole Maddox. His name. Not a threat. Not a rogue agent. An asset. Labeled for removal. He slammed the tablet down, breath ragged. This wasn't personal jealousy. This was business. They had sold him out because someone wanted him gone. And not just Sawyer. Not just Delaney. Higher. Cole looked out across the desert, wind biting his skin. He was done reacting. Done surviving. Now he was going to hunt. He whispered to himself, "They're gonna learn what the hell I was fighting for." And it wouldn't be medals. It would be truth. And ruin. Officially, Cole Maddox was dead. And he needed it to stay that way. He burned what remained of his Navy IDs. Uniform. Dog tags. All of it. Gone. The name Commander Maddox would die in that desert. The ghost that came next? That wouldn't need rank or rules. In the underground safe house he'd been relocated to, he sat across from a hacker, young, scrappy, barely out of high school. "You sure you want to disappear that deep?" the kid asked, cracking his knuckles. "You got a whole life. A whole name." "I had a whole team too," Cole said quietly. They buried both. The hacker slid him new credentials. Fake history. Clean slate. A new man. Cole stared at the name. Cal Raines. He nodded. "That'll work." The kid asked, "You got a reason for all this?" Cole looked up. Eyes hard. They think I'm dead. That's the only advantage I've got. He left that night. In D.C., he watched from a distance as Sawyer exited a high-security office building, laughing with a senator. Delaney showed up minutes later. She wore power like armor. Cold. Unshaken. They had no idea. Back at his hideout, Cole sat in the dark and whispered the truth. I died. Now I get to kill without rules. For the first time in months, he smiled. They thought killing him ended the threat. But dead men don't forgive. And this one? He'd come back with nothing to lose. The worst part wasn't that they killed him. It was that it happened by his own. Cole stood outside a Pentagon-linked defense contractor's headquarters, watching Sawyer and Delaney step into a waiting SUV. They looked powerful, untouchable, like people who'd never buried a secret in their lives. But he remembered every name in his old unit. He remembered the nights spent under the stars in Ramadi, the way they laughed after hellish raids, how they bled together, how he trusted them like family. And now, one of those brothers gave the green light to a drone strike. On him, not just approved by command, not just backed by paper, done by the men he led. Back at his safe house, Cole spread out photos across a board. Faces of the past: Sawyer, Delaney, two other former teammates, Brandon Cale and Nico Hayes. Men who stood next to him in the field. Men he now knew had signed off on Operation Quiet Tide. They weren't just witnesses. They were participants. For people, he whispered. For people stood by while I burned. A knock at the door. His contact slid him a file. You wanted Sawyer's travel records. These go back 3 years. And this too. It was a private message thread between Delaney and Sawyer. He's a threat now. You handle the logistics. I'll handle the Pentagon. They planned it all. By hand. By name. By heartless calculation. Cole leaned back in the chair, staring at the wall. They made me disappear. Now I'll return the favor. This war wasn't just about survival now. It was his. His to plan. His to control. His to finish. Cole moved like a ghost through DC's shadow corners, private contractors, rogue intelligence agents, deep state figures who owed him favors. They looked twice when they saw his face. Scarred. Different. But familiar. You're supposed to be, don't say it, Cole warned. Just give me what I asked for. He found a fixer named Miles Cora, ex-CIA, now selling intel to the highest bidder. They met in a garage under an abandoned metro station. You're hunting Sawyer? Miles asked. And the wife? She's not my wife, Cole said. Not anymore. You sure you're ready for what you'll find? Cole didn't flinch. I'm not here for peace. I'm here for justice. He left with a flash drive. Data from encrypted calls between Sawyer's firm and a shell company, Delaney's consulting firm, hidden under layers of legal cover. All roads led back to her. All this time, he thought Sawyer was the enemy. But this war? It was his wife's design. That made it personal. His mission. His revenge. His legacy to rewrite. I don't need the Navy. Don't need the command. All I need is aim. They took everything from him. So now he took everything into his own hands. Cole ditched the name Cal Rains. It was just camouflage. From now on, he'd move under no name at all. He crafted a digital attack, exposed Sawyer's firm for offshore bribery, leaked documents, incriminated partners. Money started freezing. Lawsuits stacked up. Sawyer looked shaken on a news clip, his tie loose, mouth dry. He didn't know who was behind it. But Delaney? She knew. She felt it. She had always known Cole's mind. His patience. His precision. She just never thought he'd turn it all against her. In a private meeting with her lawyer, Delaney said, "This isn't a journalist. It's not a whistleblower. This is personal. Someone's using our system against us." Her lawyer asked, "Like who?" She didn't answer. Cole, watching the feed through a hidden tap, smiled. Good. Let the fear spread. This wasn't revenge. This was a reckoning. No team. No command. No rules. Just one man with nothing left. Except a purpose he now fully owned. He once believed in the word team. That was the lie they fed him from day one. Brotherhood. Loyalty. No one gets left behind. Cole stared at a photo from 5 years ago. Their team lined up after a clean-op in Somalia. Mud-covered, bloodied, laughing. Cole had his arm around Sawyer. Nico threw up a peace sign. Brandon was smirking like always. They looked like warriors. Now he saw them for what they were, sharks in uniform, waiting for the right moment to circle and bite. He hunted down Brandon Cale first. Found him working private security in Austin under a new name. Cole didn't kill him. He did worse. He showed up in Brandon's apartment, unarmed, unannounced. "You're supposed to be dead," Cole said. "You'd know." Brandon begged. Cole gave him one option: tell the truth or be exposed. "I never wanted it to go that far," Brandon said. "It was all Sawyer. Delaney, too. She called the Pentagon. She started it." Cole recorded every word. Later, that recording would hit military forums, quietly, anonymously, the first crack in their empire. One team. For traitors. 3 left. Cole didn't just come back. He returned with purpose. Washington, D.C. was colder than he remembered. He moved like shadow through the city, parking garages, tunnels, rooftops. The places no one watches. The places where power hides. He tailed Delaney for days. Boardrooms. War councils. Cocktail events filled with men who'd never seen war. She was untouchable in public, but everyone bleeds in private. One night, she left her security detail for a personal errand. Cole followed her to a cemetery, his own grave. She stood there, alone, flowers in hand. Fake tears. "I hope you never see what you've made of me," she whispered. Too late. Cole stood 200 feet away in the dark, watching. The dead don't speak. But he would make sure they screamed before he was done. He'd come back to everything they tried to bury. The lies. The secrets. The marriage. The mission. The war behind the war. Cole sat in a dusty storage unit outside the city. On the wall behind him was a new mission map. Red threads. Names. Timelines. He wasn't chasing them anymore. He was hunting them down one by one. He recorded a voice memo for himself. He needed to hear the words out loud. "I came back to shut the door they thought was locked. I came back to finish the story. And if you're hearing this, you're already part of it." He looked straight into the camera he'd set up in the corner of the room. Then, a sudden shift in energy. A half smirk, a flicker in his eye. And in a low, cold voice, "Tell me something real. Where the hell are you watching this from? What city are you in right now? Type it in the comments. Let me know who's still awake. Because trust me, it's about to get darker." He turned away and shut off the light. Black screen. Story continues. Discovery changes everything. Not in one flash, but piece by piece. Like peeling skin off a lie. Cole had cracked Sawyer's encrypted server. It wasn't easy. He'd posed as a high-level buyer in Dubai, set up a dummy shell company, and paid a dark web broker $5,000 in crypto. It took weeks. But finally, it opened. And what he discovered proved he hadn't been paranoid. He hadn't been bitter. He'd been right. Client name, D. Maddox action requested. Target neutralization classification. Tier, for internal risk mission label. OPQT, quiet tide. Payment, cleared, 3 weeks prior to opt date. Delaney's name. Her signature. Her approval. She wasn't just aware of it. She was leading it. Cole sat frozen, staring at the screen. His jaw clenched so hard his molars ached. He blinked, but the words didn't change. She had given the green light. It wasn't about Sawyer. It wasn't even just about betrayal. This was intentional elimination. She didn't cheat on him. She erased him. He reached for a whiskey bottle, paused, then smashed it against the wall instead. The rage boiling in his chest couldn't be drowned. Not tonight. This wasn't over an affair or even betrayal anymore. This was assassination. From that moment forward, Cole's mission wasn't about proving what happened. It was about making sure they paid for every step they took after it. He wasn't just tracking them now. He was setting the stage. Every memory of his life was now a weapon. His old home? Surveillance rigged. His wedding ring? Melted into a hollow bullet casing. Even his voice, once firm, confident, was now quieter, sharper, calculated. Cole had studied every person who helped Delaney bury him. He tapped their phones, listened to late-night calls, read their insecure texts. He had also found something else. Something Delaney thought she buried. A sealed file, hidden beneath layers of spoofed email servers, audio logs from a high-level Pentagon briefing, 1 week before Quiet Tide. He's unstable. PTSD. Rebellious. If he leaks what he saw in Doha, we lose contracts in 3 regions. Cole didn't need to guess who said it. Delaney had labeled him a threat. Not because of behavior, but because of what he knew. Cole had accidentally uncovered a weapons testing scandal in Doha a year earlier. He never reported it, but someone realized he'd seen the files. That's when he became a problem. A good man. A decorated SEAL. But not convenient anymore. He was a story they couldn't control. He was his own man, and that scared them. They tried to take everything that belonged to him. His rank, his reputation, his voice. But now, everything he had left was his to weaponize. They wanted silence. Now they'd hear nothing but the sound of justice closing in. They used to call her the perfect SEAL wife. Delaney could charm senators, throw fundraisers, and speak 5 languages. She wore dresses that cost more than Cole's entire deployment bonus. She never flinched at blood on his uniform, never cried in front of reporters. But that was all performance. Underneath the surface, she was steel. Cold. Beautiful. Strategic. Cole saw her again not in person, but in real-time surveillance. She was in a glass conference room, presenting to investors from 3 nations, talking about expansion, weaponizing AI warfare. Her voice calm, her posture perfect. This was no grieving widow. This was a war architect. She laughed at one of the men's jokes, touched Sawyer's arm without blinking, like nothing had ever happened. Like her husband hadn't once bled for the flag she was now selling off piece by piece. Cole whispered, watching the screen, "You don't get to be the victim and the killer." She didn't just cheat on him with another man. She cheated with power, with empire, with control. Being a wife? That was just her cover story. What she really was a tactician. And Cole had just flipped the board. The world was about to learn the truth about the grieving wife. But before he exposed her, she was going to feel everything she thought he couldn't survive. There's a difference between who someone was and who they pretend to be. Cole sat inside an abandoned apartment overlooking the U.S. Capitol. His fingers hovered over a hard drive labeled Doha files. It had taken him weeks to crack the layers of encryption. He hadn't even been looking for it originally. But now, he knew. Delaney wasn't just a player in this conspiracy. She was the damn architect. She'd forged reports, manipulated his service record, and buried international violations under fake contractor IDs. Also, she could rise. Her weapons contracts weren't just shady, they were blood-soaked. But even that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was realizing how many moments in their marriage had been rehearsed. That look she gave him at the wedding. That night she kissed him before Syria and said, "Just come home to me." None of it was real. And still, a part of him wanted to ask her why. Why pretend to love a man you plan to erase? His fists tightened around the drive. She was everything he feared. Calculated, heartless, untouchable. But now, she was also exposed. Cole grabbed his burner phone and opened a secure drop to a journalist he once saved during a mission in Yemen. He sent the first package of intel, names, signatures, evidence. The fire was lit. As he stared out the window, Capitol lights flickering like ghosts in the fog, he whispered, "You were my world. Now you're just my next target." Delaney wasn't just connected to Operation Quiet Tide. She wasn't just aware. She was part of it. Every stage, every piece, every betrayal. Cole had uncovered the planning logs, meeting transcripts, satellite data requests, even drone targeting approvals that bore her encrypted authorization key. And now, she was sweating. He saw it in the footage he tapped from Sawyer's security system. Delaney sat at his kitchen table, pacing, wine untouched, voice low but sharp. "He's alive," she said. "It's him. It has to be." Sawyer, already unraveling, threw his glass against the wall. This wasn't part of the deal. Delaney turned slowly. "No, this is the deal. You wanted him gone. I made it happen. Don't act clean now." Cole paused the footage. There it was. Her confession. Her control. She wasn't manipulated. She wasn't scared. She wasn't dragged into something. She was part of the engine. And if she wanted to act like this wasn't personal, he'd make sure it got personal. That night, Delaney returned to her penthouse and found a photo on her bed, a photo from their wedding day burned at the edges. On the back, one line written in black ink, "You signed your part. Now I'll finish mine." Cole was collecting every broken piece of the story now. He sat in a motel room lit by a single bulb, walls covered in documents and red string. The full conspiracy was no longer theory, it was mapped out. Of all the betrayals, one hurt more than the rest. Nico Hayes, the guy who once carried Cole through enemy fire when he took a bullet in Yemen. The guy who swore loyalty with a bloodied hand and a busted jaw. Turns out, Nico had taken a $2 million payment through an offshore dummy firm, the same firm tied to Delaney's consulting company. His betrayal was the one that proved something deeper. This wasn't a relationship gone bad. It was a business deal. They didn't kill Cole out of rage. They did it for profit. He found Nico in Tampa, off the grid, running low-profile security for cargo ships. Cole confronted him at a beach bar, hood up, voice low. "Tell me why," Cole said. Nico didn't even flinch. "Because we all knew too much. You were just the unlucky one." Cole slammed him into the sand behind the bar and left him unconscious with a flash drive taped to his chest, the full record of every transfer Nico had accepted. Later that night, Cole sent the data to Homeland Security, anonymously. They'd all hang on their own wires, one by one. And when it was done, the world would know the truth of who they really were. The war had reached the edge. Not the one on a map. Not a border. The edge of exposure. Collapse. Justice. Cole stared at the wall covered in evidence, faces, documents, photos. Every thread now connected. Every ally turned. Every secret unsealed. The system they built was cracking. And Cole was the one hitting it where it bled. He had taken down Nico. Had a confession from Brandon. And now, Sawyer was panicking, freezing accounts, changing routines, doubling security. But it wouldn't save him. Because Cole wasn't coming like a ghost anymore. He was coming like a storm. In a blacked-out SUV, Cole met his final contact. A military insider who owed him a life debt. The man slid him a thin folder. Everything on Delaney's newest contract. Weapons. Drones. Private buyers in South Asia. Cole didn't say a word. Just flipped through it. Each page sealed her fate. "You're really gonna burn it all?" the man asked. Cole looked up. "I'm not burning it down," he said coldly. "I'm burning them." The war was no longer silent. No longer hidden. This was the beginning of the reckoning. Delaney always had the plan. She built her life that way, calculated, clean, pre-planned. She didn't do chaos. She didn't do improvisation. Every step was risk-managed, reviewed, rehearsed. That's why it was so satisfying to watch it all fall apart. Cole had started dropping files. Not to the government, to the press. One journalist. One whistleblower account. One perfectly timed email leak. And the story exploded. Defense contractor implicated in covert elimination plot. Leaked memos link Pentagon consultant to Black Ops cover-up. Delaney's name wasn't confirmed yet. But her lawyers were already circling. Her partners were bailing. Her investors froze funding. The plan? Gone. She was running out of rope. And Cole? He was just getting started. He sent her a private message, encrypted, impossible to trace, signed only with a symbol they both knew from their wedding day. Increment with it, a single sentence. "Nice plan. Let's see what you do without one." She stared at the screen, heart thudding. Sawyer kicked over a chair in the background. "It's him. He's playing us." Delaney turned slowly, eyes empty now. "No," she said. "He's already won." Cole returns to Washington in daylight. No more hiding. He walks the streets in plain sight, bearded, different, but not unrecognizable. He wanted them to see him, to feel the cold rise of fear in their bones. First stop, Brandon Cale's military tribunal. Cole watches from the back as Brandon's own confession is played out loud to a stunned courtroom. "We were told he was a threat." A whistle. The order came from the inside, Delaney Maddox. No one says a word. The judge's pin stalls mid-air. Cole slips out before anyone can notice. Second stop, Sawyer's estate. Cole doesn't sneak in. He walks through the front gate at 2 a.m., silent as air. Takes down the guards one by one, non-lethal. This part isn't about blood. Not yet. He finds Sawyer drunk, screaming into a fireplace. "Show yourself," Sawyer shouts. "You want me? Come get me, you son of a click." Cole steps into the room, gun raised but lowered, not to shoot, but to talk. Sawyer freezes. "I came back to watch you fall," Cole says. "But now I'm not sure if I should just let you rot, or finish what you started." Sawyer sobs, stammering. "We didn't mean to kill you. It was Delaney. She gave the order." Cole nods slowly. "Yeah," he says. "I know. She's next." He walks out the front door, vanishing before police arrive. Cole had returned. Not as a ghost. As a reckoning. He came back to see it collapse. To witness every smug smile vanish. Every dollar of blood money burn. Every lie unravel. Cole stood across the street from a federal building in Arlington, watching Delaney walk in through a side entrance. She wore all black. Hair tied. Face stiff. No makeup. No cameras. Just damage control. She had been summoned. Not charged. Not yet. But questioned. Hard. Because now the intelligence community was eating itself alive. Too many questions. Too many files suddenly surfacing. And all roads led back to her. Cole pulled his burner and typed into an encrypted message app. "You know why I came back. But you don't know what comes next." He hit send. She got the message mid-meeting and froze. Her lawyer asked if she needed a break. She just stared at the screen, blinking twice. Swallowed dry air. He'd returned to watch her drown in the world she built. And she was starting to feel the water rise. Outside the building, Cole turned to the camera again, recording his own version of the truth, like he had before. But this time, he looked through the lens like he was speaking straight to the people watching. It started with a drone. It ends with a decision. You watching this right now? Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're tuning in from. I want to know which coast, which town, which street is still awake. Because this story's not fiction. And trust me, your city might be next. He smiled, turned the camera off, and walked away into the shadows. Cole always believed the worst part of betrayal was the act itself. He was wrong. The worst part was the moment you discover it was never just betrayal. It was strategy. A long game. A sacrifice. And you were the sacrifice. The discovery came when Cole found an off-book recording, something saved in a corrupted archive from an NSA breach Delaney was tied to. He decrypted it himself, hands shaking as the file loaded. The voices were familiar. He knows too much about Doha. His accident solves everything. Is the wife on board? She's more than on board. It was her idea. Cole stopped breathing. It was her idea. The mission. The betrayal. The kill order. Delaney didn't just approve it, she orchestrated it. She had watched him hold his oath, carry his brothers, bleed for a country that saw him as a tool. And then she handed him over like a defective weapon to be retired. What was she so afraid he'd discover? What was buried in Doha? He ran facial recognition on a single blurred image in the file, a civilian child caught in a drone blast during one of Delaney's weapons test runs. Collateral. Unreported. If Cole had survived and leaked that, her empire would have burned. And that's when he realized. This wasn't just about personal betrayal. This was about covering war crimes. And she was still hiding the truth. Cole sat down, breathed deep, turned on the camera again. They tried to bury me because I discovered something they never wanted you to see. And now I'm going to make damn sure you do. Everything he had left was his. Not his rank, not his medals, not his home, but his fire, his pain, his mission, and his revenge. Cole had walked alone for almost 2 years. Lost everything. Buried in foreign dirt. Written off by the system he bled for. They thought they'd turned him into a ghost. They were wrong. He wasn't a ghost. He was a mirror. He was the reflection of everything they thought they could get away with. At 3:43 a.m., Cole hacked into the main projector feed at the Defense Procurement Conference, the one where Delaney was set to speak. On a 200-foot screen, live in front of international buyers and generals. His face appeared. Burned. Scarred. Alive. My name is Cole Maddox. I was commander of a SEAL unit you've probably read about. They killed me. Tried to. Because I knew too much. Because I was disposable. Silence swept the room. Delaney Maddox, my wife, signed the op that buried me. And now? I'm here to dig up everything she buried. The feed cut before security could respond. Delaney stood frozen behind the curtain, one hand over her mouth. She didn't cry. She was too smart for that. She whispered to herself, almost shaking, "He's not done." And he wasn't. Not until the world knew what his wife did. And not until the truth was the last thing she saw before her world crumbled. They called her a grieving widow. But he knew the truth. His wife wasn't wearing black because she mourned him. She wore it because funerals made headlines, and headlines build influence. Cole watched the latest news clip from a diner booth somewhere off I-95. On screen, Delaney stood on a podium, defending her company after the hacked video stunt. That's what they were calling his broadcast. Her voice was calm. No cracks. But her eyes? They gave her away. She was trying not to blink too much. Trying not to sweat. We have nothing to hide. These accusations are the result of a coordinated misinformation attack from an unknown source. Unknown. She still wouldn't admit he was alive. Wouldn't give him that power. But she was cracking. He saw it. And under the table, in his hand, he clutched a photo their wedding day. She wore her hair down, barefoot in the sand, holding his dog tags in her palm. Back then, he believed in forever. Now? Now he believed in consequences. He stepped out of the diner, pulled out his burner phone, and called her office. Voicemail picked up. He left one sentence. "You were white for the cameras. But we both know what kind of wife you really were." He didn't need her to call back. He just wanted her to know. He was close. She was his everything. She was the one person who made life outside the war zone feel worth surviving. She was the woman who said she'd never let him go without a fight. That version of her didn't exist. Not really. And now, the world was starting to question what was real. Congress called for an internal review. Military news forums lit up. Whispers began to leak inside intelligence circles. The story wasn't being dismissed anymore. It was being investigated. And Delaney? She was spiraling. Cole hacked into a security cam from inside her condo building and watched her pacing, talking to herself, phone in hand. Saw you're gone, she'd cut ties the minute the heat landed. No more allies. Just walls and lies closing in. On the table, next to her wine glass, was a folder marked Project Repriority. She opened it. Inside were final contingency plans, emergency clearance IDs, flight plans, offshore accounts. She was planning to run, because she knew the truth was closing in faster than any legal shield could stop it. And for the first time, she looked afraid, not of exposure, of him, the man she buried, the man who was dead, and the man who'd come back to finish what she started. Delaney was never just a participant. She was the brain, the core, the part of the machine that made the whole thing work. Cole had proof now, not just whispers or unofficial files, but raw, direct confirmation. One of her ex-employees had flipped, scared of going down with her. His testimony? She engineered the contracts. She made the calls. She signed off on the quiet tide kill order. Not approved. Signed off. Cole met with the whistleblower in a freezing warehouse 2 blocks from the Capitol. The man could barely look him in the eyes. She said if anyone found out, she had ways to disappear them too, the guy said. Cole didn't respond. Just slid him an envelope, cash, relocation info. No threats. Just closure. Then he walked out into the cold, breath sharp in the air. He thought about that phrase, part of the plan. Every time Delaney said it during their marriage, it sounded organized, calm, safe. But now he understood what her plans really meant. They weren't about building anything. They were about controlling everything. And the moment Cole stopped being part of the plan, he became the problem to be removed. But he'd flipped the game now. Now she was part of his. And her part was almost over. This wasn't just the story of a man left behind. It was the story of betrayal, built piece by piece by the very people he once bled beside. It was the story of Delaney Maddox, darling of defense, face of corporate patriotism, now standing inches from full exposure. Cole sat in the shadows of a parking garage across from the Department of Justice. A major investigative hearing was underway. Inside, behind closed doors, was a panel holding a dossier with one name written on the front. Cole Maddox, presumed deceased. The contents inside? That was his doing. Testimonies, audio logs, mission files, encrypted video, bank records, proof of a government-trained kill team, executed for profit, disguised as patriotism. He built it all up to this moment. He didn't need to pull the trigger. All he had to do was let gravity do the work. Back at her apartment, Delaney got the call. "Ma'am, I need you to come in for questioning." She didn't say a word, just stood there. On the table beside her was another message. No sender ID, just a line typed in 18-point courier font. "The truth of who you are is finally louder than the lies you sold." Delaney had built the perfect narrative. The brave widow, the visionary executive, the strong woman who turned grief into leadership. But the truth? She had orchestrated a black-budget kill-op on her own husband to protect a weapons contract from being exposed. Now the lie was cracking. Cole made sure of that. He'd released the final wave of files to an international coalition of journalists. Multiple outlets published at once. His voice, distorted but undeniable, echoed in the leak's intro. "This isn't about one man. This is about the truth we bury for the sake of convenience. This is about the cost of silence." Social media exploded. Cable news lit up. In less than 48 hours, 3 congressional staffers were suspended. 2 companies lost federal funding. And Delaney's publicist? Gone. No more spin. No more press briefings. No more control. This was the moment she feared the most, when the story became bigger than her reach. Cole didn't stop there. He left one more message on her private server, an old recording of her voice from their first anniversary dinner. "No matter what happens, you're the only thing I trust in this world." Attached to it, a single sentence. "Now you know what it feels like to be lied to." Everything was working, because everything was part of the plan. Cole didn't want her arrested right away. He didn't want her dead. He wanted her world to fall, brick by brick, until the only thing left was silence and fear. His plan wasn't revenge. It was justice. Precise. Cold. Clean. Step 1. Expose the kill order. Step 2. Turn the team against each other. Step 3. Leak the unredacted drone footage showing unauthorized strikes. Step 4. Link her offshore account to the failed Doha cover-up. And Step 5. Face her, not as husband and wife, not as soldier and civilian, but as enemies who built 2 sides of a war no one else knew existed. He was almost there. But before the final confrontation, he made one last call to the same journalist he'd been feeding intel to for months. "Ready for the last piece?" Cole asked. "Let's hear it." Cole sent over one final file, one no one had seen before. Delaney's voice, 3 years ago. "If Cole doesn't play ball, we remove him." Simple as that. The journalist paused. "You sure you want to end it like this?" Cole answered with the same voice he'd carried through every op, every storm, every betrayal. "I didn't start this story, but I sure as hell will write the ending." The story didn't explode. It unfolded, slow, devastating, deliberate, like watching a skyscraper fall in silent motion before it ever hits the ground. Cole watched from the rooftop of a federal building, listening through an encrypted channel as the Justice Department read out Delaney's formal indictment: wire fraud, unauthorized military action, obstruction, misuse of classified access, attempted assassination of a government asset. Each charge was a stone laid carefully into the grave she dug for herself. She wasn't in handcuffs yet, not publicly, but the insiders knew. The media speculated. And her investors? They were already gone. Cole had planned every detail of how her empire would unravel. He knew she'd try to cut a deal. He knew she'd throw Sawyer under the bus. What he didn't expect was what she said on a hot mic as she was leaving the closed-door hearing. A journalist's camera, accidentally left rolling, caught her voice, sharp, bitter, cracking. You think I regret it? I saved lives. He would have exposed everything. I did what had to be done. It aired. And censored. Within the hour, hashtag Delaney Maddox was trending worldwide. Every mask she wore was ripped off. She wasn't the widow. She wasn't the hero. She was the architect of a betrayal that cost blood and the soul of a man who trusted her. As it all unfolded in real time, Cole sat in silence. No fist pumping. No celebration. Just a cold exhale and a whisper to himself. She built it. I just gave the world the blueprint. Delaney's world didn't just fall. It collapsed. Quietly. Brutally. Like a star folding into itself. She was disavowed from her own company. Her board turned on her. A federal investigation froze all of her assets. International partners severed ties. Overnight, the Queen of Defense became radioactive. Cole didn't watch the live news coverage. He didn't have to. He'd already seen this moment in his mind 1,000 times. The headlines, the face she'd wear when she realized everything she protected had burned, and she lit the match herself. But it wasn't enough to collapse her business. It was time to collapse her self-image, the one that made her believe she was untouchable. So he sent her a gift, delivered in a small wooden box. No name, no return address. Inside, a USB, and her wedding ring, blackened, warped from the heat of the desert. When she plugged in the drive, it played only one thing: footage from his last mission. The drone camera, showing her face on a secure call authorizing the strike. He'd clipped it perfectly, then overlaid it with his voice. This is what you tried to kill. Not just a man, a truth. And now you get to live with it. She watched the screen, shaking. Then, she threw the laptop across the room and screamed into her own reflection, a sound no one heard, except him. Cole didn't need to watch her anymore. The collapse had begun, and the confrontation was finally here. The room was quiet. Too quiet for two people with blood between them. Cole stood in the center of Delaney's old office, high-rise, corner suite, glass on 3 sides. The skyline behind him was gray, washed out, like even the city didn't want to look her in the eyes anymore. The door opened. She walked in alone. No security. No lawyers. No mask. Just her. Her eyes locked on him like she already knew he'd be there. He didn't speak. Not at first. He wanted her to feel the weight in the air. The silence that now lived where trust used to be. She stepped forward. Slowly. You're alive, she said. It wasn't a question. Cole didn't blink. Took you long enough to say it. Delaney stared, chest rising and falling. You don't understand. No, he cut her off. You don't. He stepped forward. Just enough to feel the heat between them. The tension. The history. You signed the order, he said. You smiled at my funeral. You slept next to the man who pulled the trigger. Her voice cracked. I didn't want to. You did want to. You needed to. He tossed a folder onto the table between them. Photos. Logs. Evidence. Every piece of her plan laid out like a war map. You killed me, he said. But I didn't stay dead. Delaney's jaw clenched. Her eyes glassed over. I tried to protect what I built, she said, barely audible. You were going to destroy it. You were my wife. She didn't respond. He stepped back. I'm not here to kill you. She raised her eyes. I'm here to make sure everyone else sees what I see now. He left the room. She didn't follow. She couldn't. The truth was never meant to survive people like Delaney Maddox. People who build walls with power. People who decide who lives, who dies, and who disappears in a mission report stamped classified. But truth doesn't stay buried forever. And Cole? He made sure of that. 2 days after the confrontation, the full recording was aired globally. Every classified file. Every voice memo. Every weapon contract linked to civilian deaths in Doha. Every name. Cole had timed it perfectly. Live on the day of her final closed-door hearing, while the cameras swarmed the courthouse, her past unraveled in front of the world. We considered Commander Maddox compromised. We chose the most efficient solution. Delaney's voice. Clear. Cold. Ruthless. The nation watched in silence. families of soldiers, whistleblowers, even active military officers. For the first time, the government couldn't deny it, couldn't spin it. The truth was out. Delaney's lawyers walked out of court first, faces pale. No statements. But the people watching? They weren't interested in legal outcomes anymore. They just wanted answers. Cole stayed in the shadows. He didn't want a press conference. He didn't want to be a face. He just wanted the truth to stand alone. And it did. Strong, brutal, undeniable. He recorded one final message that night. You tried to silence me. But I wasn't the one who needed to speak. The truth did. And now it has. He clicked it off. For the first time in years, he felt still. The world had the truth now. But Cole still had one more choice to make. He sat in a cabin hidden deep in the Appalachian woods, the kind of place with no address, no signal, no sound but wind and his own breath. He hadn't spoken to another human in days. He had everything with him. The full archive. Documents Delaney never even knew he found. Proof that the corruption went deeper than just her. Generals, CEOs, elected officials. He could release it all. He could watch the whole house of cards come crashing down. Not just Delaney's empire, but the Pentagon, the defense industrial complex. Everything that had used men like him, then erased them when they stopped being useful. But if he did, more lives would be destroyed. Men still serving. Families still connected to the mission. Good people who didn't know what they were part of. He had to decide. Was he a soldier or a weapon? His hand hovered over the drive. The cursor blinked on the upload page. And in that moment, he wasn't the man they tried to kill. He was just Cole Maddox. Not commander. Not SEAL. Just a man who lost everything and could still burn the world down. Then he remembered her voice, years ago, whispering in the dark after one of his worst missions. If it ever gets too heavy, you come home. That's her choice. She said it when she meant it. Before everything broke. Now it was his turn. He clicked out of the upload window. Saved the files. But didn't send them. Not yet. Sometimes, the power isn't in what you release. It's in knowing you could. They wanted silence. Instead, Cole gave them fire. Not metaphor. Not data. Actual flames. The night Delaney's private compound in Virginia went up, the media called it arson. No one was injured. The estate had already been vacated. But the fire sent a message louder than any interview or headline ever could. And Cole? He stood on a nearby ridge in the trees, watching it burn. Alone. Quiet. No cameras. No speeches. It was symbolic. Necessary. Not just for him. For every SEAL who came back broken and forgotten. For every soldier labeled unstable, just to keep a contract from being exposed. For every name crossed out on a mission sheet, not because they failed, but because they saw too much. Inside that compound were files Delaney thought were hidden. Backups. Paper trails. Communications the cloud couldn't touch. He'd already copied them all. Now they were ash. This fire wasn't revenge. It was closure. And yet, as he watched the roof cave in, he didn't feel peace. He felt clean. Not healed. Not whole. But free. A few miles away, Delaney sat in a private holding cell, no charges formally announced yet. But everyone knew they were coming. Her lawyer slid over a photo, the burning compound. She stared at it for a long time. Then she whispered, he finally did it. No tears. Just resignation. Fire had a funny way of purifying everything. And Cole had just wiped the last piece of her kingdom off the map. For the first time in years, there was silence. No explosions. No intel drops. No panic in Delaney's voice or breaking news flashes about a shadow man exposing the machine. Just stillness. Cole sat on the edge of a lake somewhere in Montana. No name. No trace. A borrowed cabin and a wood-burning stove. His scars itched under the cold. Not the kind you see, the ones that live deep in muscle and memory. The mission was over. Delaney had been indicted. Sawyer had vanished, fled overseas, some said. Others believed Cole got to him too. No one knew for sure. Cole wasn't confirming anything. Brandon and Nico? Both entered witness protection after testifying. Neither had spoken to the press. They knew better. The Department of Defense remained quiet. No official acknowledgement of Operation Quiet Tide. No apology. No correction. Just the usual silence that comes when the truth is too big to admit. Cole could have pushed it, could have burned the rest of the system down. But he didn't. He made his choice. The truth had been spoken. The world had seen enough. And now it was time for the fire to settle. At night, he sometimes dreamed of her. Not the Delaney who betrayed him, but the one who laughed in the kitchen while barefoot, hair tied up, stealing his fries. He didn't hate her anymore. Hate takes too much breath. He just didn't remember what her voice sounded like when it was real. He breathed in. Mountain air. Crisp. Unfiltered. Silence used to feel like punishment. Now, it felt earned. They called him a myth now. The ghost of Maddox. Whispers in defense circles. Quiet mentions in Black Ops forums. Soldiers talked about him in mess halls when no brass were listening. He's alive. He took down a Pentagon contractor with just a flash drive. He burned everything, disappeared, and left no trace. Cole hadn't planned on becoming a legend. He didn't want that. Legends don't sleep. Legends don't heal. Legends live in the fear of others. But the name stuck, and in a way, it protected him. Kept the right people scared. Kept the wrong ones from looking too hard. The only physical evidence of his existence now was a security photo taken outside a bakery in Idaho. Grainy. Blurry. A scarred man in a hoodie buying coffee. It circulated on Reddit. People argued over it for days. But no one found him. Because you don't find a ghost. He remembered what one of his instructors once told him during BUD/S. The most dangerous man in the world is the one who isn't fighting for a flag, but for a memory. Now, Cole understood what that meant. He didn't fight to expose Delaney. He fought because someone tried to erase who he was. And failed. The system didn't win. It survived. But so did he. Just not as Cole Maddox. Not anymore. Now, he was the ghost they couldn't bury. And somewhere out there, in some small town with no name, he was just another man who walked alone, but never in fear again. You don't rebuild a life like patching up a wall. You start with ruins, with burned ground, with silence and scars that don't go away just because the war is over. Cole found work under a different name, no questions asked. Construction, manual labor, hauling beams and lifting drywall on a small build site outside Asheville. He liked the weight, the ache in his arms. It reminded him he still had a body, still had bones. The crew knew him as Cal, quiet guy, good worker, keeps to himself. He never took photos, didn't leave prints, paid cash for everything. At night, he slept in a room above a garage with a mattress, a space heater, and a metal box under the bed, the only thing he carried with him everywhere. Inside were 3 items, his SEAL badge, a wedding ring warped by fire, and the original drone footage that nearly ended his life. He never opened the box, but he never threw it out either. Rebuilding wasn't about pretending none of it happened. It was about choosing not to let it define the rest of what came next. Some days, he thought about going back, finding a real name again, maybe even telling someone the truth, some version of it. But then he remembered the headlines, the eyes watching, the fear in their silence. The truth had its moment. Now it was time to live in the quiet after. On his lunch break one afternoon, a kid on the crew asked, "Hey Cal, you were military, right?" Cole didn't flinch. Something like that. The kid nodded. Just figured. You stand different. Cole smiled to himself. Maybe some pieces never stop standing. Grief doesn't hit all at once. It trickles through songs, smells, photos, old furniture, the way a woman somewhere laughs like the one who broke your heart. And memory? It doesn't ask permission. It just shows up. Cole walked through a secondhand shop on a rainy Sunday. He wasn't looking for anything. Just passing time. Killing quiet. And there it was, a Polaroid camera. Same model he and Delaney used to carry on road trips. He hadn't thought about it in years. But the flash of a moment came back like a punch. Her sitting cross-legged on the hood of their Jeep, snapping a picture of him eating gas station chips and grinning. Back then, they weren't political, weren't rich. Just 2 people chasing peace in the middle of a world that never had any. He turned the camera over. It still worked. He didn't buy it. He just held it for a moment, long enough to let the memory settle, then put it down and walked out. That night, he sat on the floor of his room and opened the metal box. For the first time in years, he held the ring in his hand. Not with hate, not with longing, just with clarity. She was a memory now. So was the man who once loved her. He stared out the window at the darkness stretching beyond the trees. "You can survive anything," he whispered, "once you remember who you were without them." And for the first time, he felt free. Closure isn't clean. It's not a speech. It's not a court sentence. It's not someone looking you in the eye and saying sorry. It's a decision you make without the other person in the room. Cole stood at a cemetery just outside Alexandria. No cameras, no fanfare. A fog hung low, and the air was cold enough to bite. His boots crushed the wet grass as he walked toward the grave that still had his name etched on it. Commander Cole Maddox Kia, honored for service. He stared at it for a long time. It was strange, standing over your own death. A woman passed by on the far path, walking her dog. She glanced his way but didn't recognize him. Just another quiet man at a military grave. There were thousands of them, all with names, some with truth, most without. Cole knelt down, reached into his jacket, pulled out the seal badge, scratched, worn, a piece of the life they tried to erase, and set it gently against the stone. Then he whispered, voice low and certain, "You can keep this. That life died here." He stood up, didn't look back. He wasn't saying goodbye to the badge, or to Delaney, or to the system. He was saying goodbye to the part of him that needed this war to define him. And with that, he walked away from his own grave and toward whatever came next. People wanted a trial. They wanted to see Delaney locked in a courtroom, cameras flashing, the woman who smiled in front of the flag now explaining her lies under oath. But Cole had always known, real justice doesn't always look like that. It's not always about bars or sentences. Sometimes justice is being seen for what you really are, with no place left to hide. Delaney's reputation was gone. The world knew her face, her name, her crimes. She didn't get jail time, not yet. She got silence, public shunning, frozen assets, foreign blacklists. No one returned her calls. She couldn't walk into a restaurant without eyes burning holes through her. Even her own father, a retired general who once said she'd rebuild the American war legacy, publicly disowned her. She was alive, untouched physically, but her power was gone, and she'd built her life around that power. That was the sentence. Cole watched a final interview one night, a special report, a roundtable of ex-military officials discussing the Maddox case. One of them said something that stuck. What Cole Maddox did wasn't vengeance. It was balance. He brought the scale back where it belonged. Cole turned off the screen. He didn't need their approval. Justice didn't live in headlines or history books. It lived in what he did with the rest of his life. And for the first time, that life belonged only to him. It started in silence. And it ended there too. But this time, the silence was his. No war zone. No strike team. No flash drives being uploaded in the dark. No voices begging for mercy on secure comms. No headlines screaming his name. Just a small room. A steady clock. A window cracked open to let the wind in. Cole sat at a table in a cabin somewhere north of Oregon. He didn't write. He didn't speak. He just listened. Birds. Branches. The kind of peace you don't get unless you've earned it the hard way. Through fire and blood and every lie carved into your back by someone who once said they loved you. The world had moved on. Delaney was out of the spotlight now, a walking ghost of a scandal too dangerous for full prosecution. She gave one last interview, sanitized and mechanical, then vanished into the shadows of private exile. No charges. No redemption. Just the memory of what she'd done, and the knowledge that people would never forget. Sawyer? Still off the map. Some said he was dead. Others said he was living under a new identity in Panama. Cole didn't care. The others were quiet too. It was like everyone had agreed, without saying a word, to leave the story behind. No one dared say his name in public anymore. Too dangerous. Too disruptive. Too close to truth. But in private, the story still lived. Some called him a myth. Some said he was a traitor. Some swore he was a patriot who exposed the rot at the core. Cole didn't care what label they put on him, because for the first time in his life, he didn't need the world to see him. He chose the silence, and that made all the difference. He stepped outside into the open air, lifted his face to the cold sky, and took a deep breath. Not because he had to, but because he could. You don't get to choose how people remember you. All you can do is leave something behind that forces them to look closer. Cole never wanted a legacy. Not in the way Delaney did. Her name engraved on plaques, printed on foundations, whispered in meetings behind polished doors. She wanted permanence. He wanted peace. And after everything, he finally realized, maybe you don't build a legacy with what you hold on to. Maybe you build it with what you let go of. The world still talked about the Maddox case. In defense circles, it was now studied like a virus outbreak, a case file labeled internal risk management failure. In journalism schools, it was a warning. When the truth gets buried, it finds its own way out. But Cole, he was just a story told in parts. A myth. A shadow. No one knew where he was. But they knew what he did. That was the legacy. Not fame. Not revenge. Not medals. Proof that the system could bleed. Proof that silence doesn't mean surrender. Proof that even when the world tries to erase you, you can come back, reshape the story, and leave a crack in the wall big enough for light to get through. One night, Cole sat at a small desk in his cabin. No light, but a candle. No audience, but the air around him. He wrote a letter. Not to Delaney. Not to the government. Not even to himself. It was addressed to a name on the Department of Defense recruitment list, a 22-year-old SEAL trainee whose brother died on Cole's final mission. The kid would never know the full story unless someone told him. So Cole did. This isn't about glory, he wrote. This is about truth. About paying attention to who's really standing beside you, and who's waiting to step over your body the second you fall. If you want to serve, serve. But never forget who you are without the uniform. He signed it with his real name. Folded it. Sealed it. No return address. That was enough. He didn't need the world to know who he was. He just needed someone to. Because in the end, legacy isn't measured in what you destroy. It's measured in what you leave behind that still stands. The story didn't end with an explosion. It ended with a man walking away. No medals. No applause. Just footprints in the dirt, and the world left a little more honest than he found it. Cole Maddox didn't want to be remembered, but somehow he was. And maybe that's what justice really looks like. Not the fall of kings. Not the courtroom cheers. Just a man surviving the fire and refusing to disappear quietly. Because in the end, they tried to erase him. And he became the ending they couldn't control. Now it's your turn. Yeah. You, sitting there with your eyes glued to the screen, probably still thinking about that one scene that hit too hard, or that one twist you didn't see coming. Tell us something. Where are you watching from right now? Which part of the story hit you the most? And if you were in Cole's shoes, would you have walked away or burned it all? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Every single one matters. Because stories like this, they don't live in files. They live in memory. They live in you. If this story grabbed you by the collar and didn't let go, tap that like button. Let us know it meant something. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And hit that subscribe plus bell icon so you don't miss what's coming next. Because we're not done telling the kind of stories that aren't afraid to speak the truth. This was Navy SEAL commander left for dead by his own team. Returns to discover his wife was part of the plan. And we just told it all. Now it's over to you. Tell us in the comments, how did this story hit you? Was it justice? Was it tragedy? Was it revenge done right? We'll be reading every single one. Until next time, stay sharp, stay real, and